The picnic table tipped like a slow-motion car crash, plates skittering across the grass, beer cans ricocheting into the hydrangeas, and the world narrowed to a single sharp sound, my sister Rachel screaming. Laura's voice cut through everything, thin, flat, dangerous, two words I had never heard her use before in that tone. Bruno, secure. The German shepherd was a missile. He launched, muscles folding, jaws closing on Rachel's forearm with a wet, unforgiving clamp. I moved without thinking, heart in my throat, adrenaline burning like cheap whiskey. And the next second I was on top of Bruno, sliding on grass slick with spilled sauce and something darker. I dove in, felt bone against glove, smelled hot blood and grill smoke, and saw Grace, 9, pressed to the kitchen window with eyes so wide they filled the whole glass, while Owen, 5, hiccuped and sobbed in the hallway because he didn't understand how grown-up things could be this loud and sharp and wrong. Neighbors were already in motion like a slow wave breaking. Mr. Patel from next door sprinting in slippers, the Hendersons dragging lawn chairs as if those chairs could stake a claim back to calm. Someone had already begun dialing 911, my mother screaming into the phone so loudly her words were half prayer, half accusation, "Get them here, get them now." I could hear the static of the call and the neighbor's breath hitching with every beat. Rachel kept screaming high and ragged and Bruno's teeth were fixed, smarter and steadier than panic. And for a second my body betrayed me and wanted to freeze, to watch, to understand how this happened like you watch a car sink. Instead I rolled, jammed my forearm between his jaws and felt that solid, awful thing bone against my glove. It felt impossible and real, a collision of flesh and iron, and a smell of copper and live heat climbed my nose. Laura's command had an edge I had never heard before, a different voice than the one that said honey or be careful. When she repeated it, it wasn't an order to a dog, it was a line in the sand. Bruno, secure, she said again, and suddenly the training we had invested in, the hours of work with a handler and the money and the quiet pride became the thin hinge we all pivoted on. Bruno tightened, not attacking now but holding, like a clamp on a fact that couldn't be denied. I forced my weight down, trying to separate teeth from arm, feeling leather chew and muscle pull under my palms, thinking of the kids' faces at that window and the way Laura's hands were trembling but steady like she had decided how to be in that moment. I thought of how many times before I had smiled when Rachel came over with ice cream for the kids, how I had waved away the little pricks at the base of my neck when Laura mentioned worry, how protecting had been something I assumed would come naturally. In that wet, blazing second, that assumption felt like a cheap shirt tearing off. Rachel's forearm bled bright and thick. It painted the grass in quick strokes and an awful metallic smell rose with the smoke from the collapsed grill, hot and sweet and familiar. A plate shattered underfoot, the sound cut like paper. People were shouting, not really at anything specific, just shouting into the hole the attack had made in our afternoon. My mother was still on the phone, words spilling. She was telling the dispatcher where we lived, but her voice kept breaking to ask questions that were already answered by the sight. Is she breathing? Is she conscious? My hands were shaking so hard I could feel the tremor go through Bruno into Rachel and back again, all of us a clumsy machine of hurt and force. I remember grabbing Rachel's shoulder and hauling, not gently, because there wasn't room for gentleness. I remember the sound of Bruno's restraint as Laura clicked a leash, the animal control training line that felt both like salvation and damnation. The dog was still poised, ready to react, a taut instrument, and neighbors were in the periphery with phones out, faces pale and stunned as if they had walked into someone else's nightmare by mistake. Grace's small face at the window, chin sticky with spilled lemonade, said everything and nothing. Owen's sobs turned into a keening that made me angry in a new way, a protective kind of rage that didn't look like fury but like a shield lowering over them. My sister kept saying in broken little bursts between gasps, I didn't, and the word was useless and dangerous, and I wanted to slap it out of her mouth because it sounded like a denial, and denials had teeth. Time compressed into a jagged reel. A paramedic's voice instructing us to let go, my mother pacing with her head in her hands, the smell of blood and charcoal and sunscreen mixing into a scent that would later live in my nightmares. I let Bruno go when the paramedics told me, when a uniform reached in with gloved hands to pull Rachel away and wrap her arm with something that smelled of hospital bleach and fear. For a long beat after she was moved, the backyard felt like a room that had been emptied suddenly of furniture, a hush heavy enough to hold every accusation that had been thrown through it. I stood there, bleeding adrenaline, shirt torn, grass in my knees, and realized the afternoon had pivoted into something legal and sharp and immediate. Everything else would have to follow that pivot. But in that raw, gaslit moment, all I could do was fold into the space between my children's cries and the distant, panicked instructions of strangers who had just become authorities. I had Rachel pinned on the grass and Mark. My brother-in-law had her other arm, and she was screaming like someone cornered by a myth, spitting conspiracies about jealousy and money and revenge. Her words were all teeth and spit, high and frantic, and they kept trying to fill the empty space where an explanation should live. I could feel the muscles in her shoulder tighten under my hand, like a trapped animal, and the backyard smelled of charred steak and lemon cleaner and the sharp iron of blood already seeping into the earth. A butcher knife lay on the picnic table we'd used for the steaks, grease still on the handle, sunlight catching the blade so it flashed like a warning every time someone moved. The sound of Grace at the window, small and wide, kept folding me back into what mattered. I pinched that thought and used it like leverage. Then Rachel's hand moved. It was small, almost casual, as if reaching for a remote, but my body saw it as a headline. Her fingers slid toward that greasy handle and something cold and animal clicked loose in me. This was no longer about words or denial, it was about immediate threat. I remember the graceless, ugly kick. My right foot smoked the side of the table and the knife flew 10 feet, arced, and slammed into the grass like a dropped verdict. It bounced, metal on blade catching the sun, and for a beat I thought it was all slow motion, a bad film that wouldn't cut away. Mark cursed and shoved further, trying to keep Rachel from twisting, from lashing out. I kept thinking how small and fragile Owen and Grace looked through the window and how nothing justified that reach. No string of accusations, no hatred, could make a knife toward our kids anything but the apex of wrong. When her hand went for the blade, Laura reacted with a voice I will file with the hard things, shaking, precise, the tone of someone who has finally decided what kind of person they are. She called Bruno off with a recall I had only ever heard in practice sessions at the trainer's field, crisp, calm, and absolute. Bruno recall. The dog stopped mid-growl, teeth still bared, head snapping back at the word like he'd hit a brake. For a second there was this awful puppet silence where everything was held by training and not by kindness. Bruno backed off but stayed between Rachel and the house, watchful and dangerous in a way that made the air vibrate. That recall became a hinge for what came next. People later told me that the way she said it, the exact word, was what kept real harm from happening that day. Neighbors later told the detective what they'd seen, the small sliding motion of a hand toward the knife, the kick of the table, the exact moment the blade left the picnic top and landed in the grass, and Detective Monroe wrote all of it down like it was currency. They said the kids' faces at the windows were frozen, that someone had filmed parts of it on their phones before they realized it was evidence and not entertainment. That testimony ended up being vital, not because a neighbor's glance proved intent on its own, but because it confirmed a timeline. A live, dangerous motion toward a weapon, then a purposeful command that stopped the dog and held the scene together. The prosecutors would later call that a legal hinge, proof that immediate protection was needed, that our kids' safety wasn't theoretical but acutely threatened in the seconds before the knife flew. I kept replaying how I had ignored Laura before, how I'd smiled when she first said she was worried, how I had shrugged off the small alarms as stress or fuss. In that grass and blood and broken plate light, the man who had joked about every scar in our house vanished, and a different version of me took over, shaken, angry, fierce in a way I hadn't liked at first glance but was glad of now. My hand still smelled of meat and metal. Blood smeared the cuff of my shirt and a smear of lemon cleaner was on my knee from trying to wipe it away. We pulled the kids into a room and shut the doors. Everyone's phones were buzzing with 911 updates and later with detectives' calls. I sat on the edge of the couch and felt a strange, steely resolve grow inside me, a quiet promise to the kids that if I had been slow to listen before, I wasn't going to be slow to act now. The rest, evidence, police, court, was coming. But for those first scratched, terrible minutes, all I could do was be loud and certain and keep my family in the small, brutal shelter of my arms. The yard had barely stopped screaming when Laura fished Rachel's phone out of a folding chair and held it up like a badge, and I remember the way her fingers trembled as she tapped the screen. She said she'd woken at 2:00 a.m. to a notification and couldn't get back to sleep, like some bone-deep itch wouldn't let her. She checked the phone in the dark and found a folder that made her throw the covers off and sit straight up, stuff she swore at first she didn't want to believe. I stood there half-stunned and listened while she told us what was on it, and the backyard noise shrank until only her voice and the phone lights mattered. She showed us 7 hours of footage compressed into a single file, and watching that little timestamp crawl felt like watching a clock at someone else's execution. The video wasn't just a minute or two. It went on, Rachel alone with the kids in different rooms, and it was the kids' voices you heard the most, small, confused, sometimes saying stop or asking why they had to be quiet. Laura pressed play and the sound hit like water. Grace's voice, thin and pleading, came from the phone, and the garden around us became an animal that had been poked with a stick. I could feel every neighbor's face turn toward us as if the sound had been a slap on the side of the house. There were also dozens of cloud photos linked to Rachel's account, pictures of our children asleep in their beds, photos that no babysitter should have, shot at times when we were sure everyone was home. Laura scrolled and the photos kept coming, morning light, night lights, tiny hands, the same throw pillow in different shots. Those pictures were obeying a logic that chilled me. Whoever took them was planning for use later, saving evidence of innocence or vulnerability like someone making a ledger. I kept thinking of how routine those pictures would have seemed if you didn't know what they were being read for, and how close we had been to never seeing this file at all. Then Laura opened a scanned page of a journal and we all went quiet in a way that felt like the world holding its breath. The pages were handwritten and careful, full of notes that read like a script and a calendar and a lawyer's docket all at once. There were lines that said plainly how to manufacture a case, notes on which bruises could be photographed to look suspicious, and scripts for anonymous calls to CPS that used the right phrases to trigger investigations. A receipt for a storage unit on Route 17 was in the folder, dated 7 months earlier, and my chest tightened when I saw it. 7 months of quiet planning with a space rented to put things where nobody would look. Laura showed me the list that made my stomach flip. Names of families Rachel had babysat, dates and times, and then a separate page with logistics. What to say to a child to make them keep quiet, how to frame a bruise as evidence, how to edit an audio so it sounded like something else. The handwriting was Miriam's kind of neat enough to show intention. For a long minute I sat on the edge of the picnic table with my hands on my knees and let the shame flood me. How many times had I laughed when Laura told me she was uneasy? How many times had I said, "She's family," and shoved it away like a plate into the dishwasher? I remember Laura holding the phone up again and showing a clip where Grace's small voice begged, "Please stop," in that way only a frightened child can. It was nothing I would ever volunteer to replay, but everyone there watched in a stunned silence that felt like a court waiting for someone to speak. My mother stopped pacing and sank onto a folding chair as if the air had lost all purpose. The neighbors who had leaned over the fence were suddenly people who had witnessed an impossible thing, then looked away because the thing was now personal and raw and unbearable to hold. That night made me realize how much trust I had misplaced. I had been the kind of man who wanted to believe the world worked like it should, that family meant safety by default. That belief had blinded me to details Laura had quietly collected and tried to show me before. Standing there with the phone's blue light painting Laura's face, I felt the slow switch in me from the man who nods and hopes to the man who reads the evidence and does not look back. The rest of the afternoon folded into names and numbers and a phone call to a detective. But the thing that would not leave me was the sound of Grace's voice in that clip, small and clear, asking for it to stop. The paramedics worked on her arm like they were trying to pin time down, white gloves, quick words, a tourniquet, and the scratch of gauze. It bled a lot, the blood was bright and angry, and when they wrapped it I could smell hospital bleach and alcohol on the bandages, that sterile smell that somehow made everything more real. They told Rachel to try to breathe and spoke in the clipped, practiced voices of people who have seen the worst and still show up. I kept replaying the kick that sent the knife flying and the memory of the serrated edge glinting in the grass, and the paramedic's hand was suddenly the only soft thing in the world. Uniformed officers moved through the yard slow and careful, photographing everything the way archaeologists dust off bones. Flash after flash lit the plates on the ground, the dented table leg, the smear of blood on the picnic bench, and the photographer's camera made a hollow, steady sound that felt like a heartbeat. An officer took the knife, another bagged a scrap of a napkin, and they sealed both in clear evidence bags with printed tape and a label. When they took Rachel's phone, the phone heavy and warm from her pockets, they folded it into an evidence pouch, and I watched as its screen went black like someone closing a book I didn't want to end. Detective Rachel Monroe arrived with the kind of presence that fills a room, calm, direct, and sharp as a blade. She wore plain clothes that somehow made her seem less frightening and more like authority folded into common sense. She spoke to Laura first, then to me, and called a tech over to download metadata, while another officer wrote everything down with a clipboard that was so full of notes it looked like it might weigh the writer down. The tech worked quickly, pulling timestamps, cloud sync logs, and file histories off the phone like combing through a ledger. Detective Monroe told us not to touch anything else, to preserve phones, cameras, and any devices someone might have used, because metadata can tell a timeline and timelines are what build cases. Evan Cruz from Child Protective Services arrived and sat across from us on the back step, with a soft, steady look that made me want to be better and worse at the same time. He told us in a voice meant to be kind, but firm, that the children would need forensic interviews by trained professionals, and that we could not ask them about details or prompt them. Let them tell their story on their terms, he said, and I felt my stomach twist because it sounded right and also like a rule I had broken by thinking about it all night. He explained that interviews would be scheduled with Naomi Carter at the Advocacy Center, a person skilled in gentle questioning, and that everything we said in the yard that day would be written down and used later. Evan's instructions turned our backyard into a scene that had to be remembered precisely, and not rewritten by family talk or gossip. Then Derek Walsh from Animal Control measured Bruno's bite and circled it with a soft pen like a scientist cataloging a specimen. He wore a uniform and a face made of small kindnesses. He talked about quarantine and vaccination checks while he took photos of the wound and stamped a form. 14 days, he said, and I heard the number like a sentence. He explained we had to keep Bruno at a facility for observation to make sure no rabies risk existed and that they would test the bite site for severity. I thought of Bruno's muzzle in my hands and the way he'd obeyed Laura's command, and the word quarantine made my chest ache in a new way. This animal who had protected us was suddenly part of an investigation. By the time dusk fell, evidence bags were stacked like clean, ugly trophies on the picnic table. Rachel's phone, the journal, the knife, a grass-stained napkin, and a neighbor's phone that had filmed the last part. People who had been watching through their fences came forward and volunteered to be witnesses, telling the officers what they'd seen, the recall command, the reach for the knife, the way the kids had looked at the window. Everyone's devices were recorded, phones were collected, and a chain of custody log began to snake through clipboards and labels. It felt like theater meets bureaucracy, the legal stage setting itself around our gate, with gloves and bags and camera flashes marking each step so nothing could be washed away by time or memory. I stood in the doorway and watched it all unfold, hands sticky from wiping at my face, tired and wired in the same breath. The detective asked Laura for timestamps she'd seen on the files and asked me to recount how events had started. My words felt clumsy and too human against the precise forms they were filling in. The house smelled of lemon cleaner, bleach, and the faint copper of old blood, and somewhere inside me a new kind of resolve was building. One that would follow every sealed envelope and every metadata pull, not because a man wanted revenge, but because a father wanted proof that the world could still be made safe enough for his children. We were back at the storage facility before sunrise, the sky abruze and the fluorescent lights humming like insects over the rows of metal doors, and I remember thinking the place smelled like dust and old fabric and something colder, like secrets left in the dark. Detective Monroe had a preservation order signed by a judge at about 5:45 a.m. The paper looked small in her hand but heavy with meaning. The attendant pointed us to Unit 214 on Route 17, the one Laura had found on the receipt in Rachel's notebook. The lock came off with a clunk that sounded louder than it should have, and the door peeled up and released a breath of staged childhood. Disney sheets over a twin, a small pillow with a cartoon stain, toothbrushes in a caddy, and labels on storage bins with our kids' names written in someone else's hand. Seeing Grace's purple jacket folded on a shelf felt like a punch. It was a private thing made public, and the way it sat there quiet and clean was almost worse than if it had been ruined. The room was arranged like a storybook version of a bedroom, the kind of scene you set for a movie about stolen childhoods, and for a moment I felt like I was walking through someone else's script. A tech went straight for the locked bin in the corner and worked the padlock with a practiced hand. He pulled out a laptop bag and then, almost as if it had been the prize at the bottom of a well, an external hard drive wrapped in bubble wrap. The drive was warm enough to prove it had been plugged in recently. When the tech connected it to his machine, the file listings rolled up like evidence, backups dated back 14 months, matching nights and dates where Rachel's calendar showed she'd been over. Every file had a timestamp and a location tag that made my stomach hollow. Files that matched the nights she'd babysat were there, like a ledger you could not argue with. Purchase and shipment records were the kind of small things that kill the pretty stories. The tech pulled up receipts showing the surveillance cameras had been bought 5 weeks earlier on Rachel's credit card and shipped to a PO box tied to that very unit. The shipping logs showed an origin in another state and a trail that led across lines, which is the kind of breadcrumb that wakes up federal agents. There were cloud sync logs too. Accounts linked to Rachel's email had backups and photos uploaded at odd hours, and the metadata tied those uploads back to IP addresses outside our county. Detective Monroe looked at me once and said quietly, "This isn't just local anymore." Hearing her say it made my reality expand in a way I didn't want it to. The mess was bigger than my backyard, and it had footprints that led beyond state borders. They began bagging things like they were cataloging a crime museum. Toothbrushes in one bag, the purple jacket folded into paper and sealed, the external drive put into an evidence pouch with a barcode sticker, and a printout of the purchase receipts clipped to a report. The tech copied the drive in front of us with a clean, efficient hum, while Detective Monroe interviewed the storage clerk and notated every serial number. I watched numbers and timestamps overlay the moments in my head. The dates kids had been left with her, months of cloud uploads, the storage unit booked 7 months ahead like a small, patient plan. My phone buzzed with calls I didn't want to take. My mother texted that she'd started a list of other families Rachel had babysat, and the list made the room feel like it had edges you could measure by counting names. By midday, a federal agent showed up who wore a plain jacket and a look that said they only came out for things that mattered in a way the local cops did not. They asked Detective Monroe to hand over copies of the drive's image and the cloud logs because crossing state lines activates other statutes, things that turn a county case into a federal one. That word federal landed on me like a weight. It meant a different level of attention, different rules, and a paperwork tide that would change people's lives. Standing there in that hum of machines and stamped evidence bags, I felt equal parts relieved and terrified. The drive had broken the case open, and what it revealed meant Rachel wasn't just a problem we could hush away with a family talk. She had built a plan with racks and timestamps and shipping labels, and the law would have to untangle it. We had sought protection that afternoon because our kids' safety was immediate, but this morning the scale tipped toward prosecution, step by precise step. Someone else would now prove the truth we already knew in our bones. At 10:00 a.m. the next morning, Naomi Carter met us at the Advocacy Center in a room that smelled faintly of crayons and lemon cleaner, and I remember thinking the place looked made to heal. Naomi moved slowly and spoke softly. The room was filled with toys, puppets, and a child-sized table, all arranged to make a frightened kid feel ordinary. She told us she would use play and open questions so Grace and Owen could say what they needed without leading them, and that calm steadied something raw in my chest. They interviewed Grace first while Owen waited nearby with a counselor, and then Naomi brought Owen into the same small, safe space. The way Naomi used a puppet and simple choices instead of yes or no questions let the kids tell their stories in pieces, in ways that made sense to them. Evan Cruz from CPS sat with us afterward and explained the forensic process with a steadiness that felt like a tool you could hold on to. No leading, no suggesting, let them speak. He warned again, quietly but firmly, that we had to say nothing to anyone, especially not to Rachel or her lawyers. Prosecutor Mark Reyes called later the same day, and his voice left no room for doubt. He was taking the criminal side personally and adding charges layered on top of what our local detective had built. He told us to refuse to talk if Rachel's civil attorney called and to forward any communication to his office. He explained that beyond assault, there would be counts for conspiracy and federal production because the files had crossed state lines. He used words that sounded like instruments: metadata, interstate transfer, production counts. When he said bail was set at $450,000 with no contact allowed and electronic monitoring, the number landed on me like a fact I could stitch into a future where the kids were safer. Evan laid out a safety plan while Naomi typed notes into a tablet. Change the locks immediately, notify the kids' schools and therapists, file a temporary protective order, and implement supervised handoffs for anyone still allowed near the kids. He told us to put emergency numbers on speed dial and to keep a bag of comfort items for the children, favorite blankets, a stuffed animal, a simple routine for bedtime that would anchor them in predictability. The plan felt small and concrete and real in a way legal papers were not. It was how we kept their days from unraveling while the law did its work. Detective Monroe kept close, and her presence made the case feel precise instead of chaotic. She coordinated with the techs who had copied the hard drive and the federal agents who'd stepped in because of the interstate evidence trail. She told me to keep a log of every interaction about the case, to preserve every text and email, and to let her know immediately if anyone tried to contact or intimidate us. I began carrying a notebook and a pen like a talisman, writing times and names and short facts so memory couldn't be twisted later. Animal Control said Bruno had to stay secured while a hearing would decide his fate, and Derek Walsh collected the obedience certificates and trainer notes we had kept from years of classes. The trainer's records and Bruno's certification were pieces of a different argument. They showed he had been trained to obey a specific recall under stress, that he did not attack without command, and that the bite happened in the context of a protection order issued by Laura in real time. We gathered those records and photos of Bruno's prior work with children and neighbors to show he had never been dangerous absent a provocation that day. Every call and paper pushed the backyard incident into a wider arena, and the legal storm that had formed over our gate grew heavier and colder. Federal interest changed what I had thought would be a private family disaster into a public, prosecutable crime with far-reaching consequences. Mark Reyes told us bluntly the prosecution would be aggressive and that evidence from the drive, the cloud, and the storage unit would be central. He asked us to prepare for subpoenas and a long haul. I cycled between relief and guilt. Relief that professionals were taking the lead and guilt that I had been slow to listen before the phone showed the truth at 2 in the morning. Laura and I started counseling right away, partly because we needed to move in sync for the kids, and partly because my silence had been a betrayal we both had to untangle. We met with Dr. Claire Bennett for a first session within days to plan trauma-informed therapy. She explained the long arc of healing and the small, steady measures that would matter most. The legal wheels began to turn with cold efficiency, but the center of it for me stayed small and human. The kids' rooms, the puppet Naomi used, the kettle cooled on the stove when they needed a warm drink at night. I kept that image because it was the thing I could protect in the oncoming storm, the place where truth met care, and where, after months or years of paperwork and courtrooms, we hoped the kids might find the shape of ordinary again. My father spent the day like a man possessed, sitting at our old kitchen table with a legal pad, an aching little lamp, and a stack of family photos he kept turning over like cards. He wanted to believe it was a mistake at first. He kept saying, "She's been good to the kids," in the way people try to summon a kinder world by speaking it aloud. But the receipt from Route 17 and the cloud timestamps and the purple jacket cracked that belief fast, and he began to write. By evening, he had 13 names on his list. Families Rachel had babysat over the last several years, birthdays she'd covered, sleepovers she'd hosted, and dates when she'd been alone with other children. The list sat in front of Detective Monroe by the time she returned my father's voicemail. Her calm voice on the other end made him cry, and when he handed the pad to her through the kitchen door, she said she would follow up on every name. Forensics crawled through Rachel's devices with the kind of patience that feels clinical and cruel all at once. They found forum posts and private messages that read like how-to notes, talks about grooming techniques, ways to avoid suspicion, tips on editing audio to create plausible deniability. Reading the summaries in the detective's office felt like watching someone lay bricks for a wall you never thought would be built around your house. Those writing traces weren't hypothetical. They tied to timestamps, showing discussions happening the same week's backups were made and the storage unit was paid for. When Detective Monroe said the DA was adding conspiracy and interstate production charges, the air in the interview room got colder. Those words explained why federal agents had looked up from their laptops and stepped into the case the morning of the raid. The legal strategy hardened into something precise and terrible. Prosecutor Mark Reyes explained that conspiracy charges would follow the evidence of planning, and interstate production counts came from the movement of files across state lines and digital borders. He told us the state would push for a full indictment, and that federal investigators would look for every instance where material crossed jurisdictions. His tone was methodical and not vengeful. It felt like someone trying to make a net that would hold hard and not let the truth slip away. I listened and wrote down what he said because writing made it real in a way shouting never could. Therapy began almost immediately because the adults around my kids had learned a brutal lesson too late. Dr. Claire Bennett met with Grace and Owen first, in a soft room with light from a small window and a smell like boiled tea and paper. She used steady, trauma-informed methods and explained that recovery would be slow and full of setbacks. Naomi's forensic interviews fed into a therapy plan that let the kids have control over what they told and when. Laura and I started individual work before we tried couples therapy because our counselor said we needed to be honest with ourselves first. My silence, my jokes, my casual shrugging away of Laura's concerns had built a canyon between us. Sitting in Dr. Bennett's office, I had to tell the truth to a stranger and hear it reflected back. How I had minimized Laura's fears and how that minimization was now something I would live with until I proved otherwise. We cut off unsupervised extended family contact like ripping off a bandage, abrupt, necessary, and painful. We instituted monthly device sweeps around the house, pulling every tablet and phone onto a kitchen counter for a quick forensic glance, and we had a home security company install a system with monthly scans specifically for hidden cameras. Those measures felt practical and invasive at the same time, but I liked the invasiveness because it was work I could do. We also made rules. Every babysitter must be vetted in writing, no one gets alone time with the kids without two adults present, and anyone who wanted access had to be cleared through our safety plan first. The rules were a fence that I could put my body behind, and in a new way I liked knowing the line I drew. Emotionally, it was devastating, my shame lodged in my chest like a stone I carried everywhere. I kept replaying Laura's 2:00 a.m. breathless voice showing me the files and the way I had smiled and waved it away before the proofs existed. But alongside that shame grew a fierce, steady resolve that felt clearer than anything else. I would not let my blind faith be a weapon against my children. I would listen. I would make the calls. I would stand in court and in meetings and repeat the truth until it sank into the paperwork the way it had into my bones. The days blurred into meetings, therapy sessions, and paperwork, and in the middle of it all I learned the new shape of protection. How messy it can be, how public, and how absolutely necessary. The courtroom felt smaller than the backyard had, but heavier, like a room full of paper and light where nothing could be shouted away. Evidence came at us in a precise, cold order. Metadata timelines that showed files uploading at 3 in the morning from Rachel's account, photographs from the storage unit staged like a child's room, Naomi Carter's careful interview notes, the hard drive image that matched cloud backups, and neighbor videos that captured the exact reach for the knife I had kicked away. Every piece fit together like teeth in a jaw, and I watched the prosecutor lay them out with a calm that made my stomach both drop and settle. The FBI had flagged the interstate backups early, and an agent from the unit sat in the gallery most days, filing copies of the digital trail into a thicker folder that meant federal scrutiny and tougher consequences. Rachel eventually took a plea that shocked some of the relatives who still wanted simple answers. She pleaded guilty to multiple state counts and admitted to elements that fed the interstate production concerns, and when the judge handed down sentence, it landed in the mid-teens, years that would be measured in calendars and check-ins, not gossip. She was ordered to register for life, to undergo mandatory treatment, and to have permanent no-contact orders with minors. The plea spared the kids the trauma of a public trial, but it did not feel like mercy. It felt like an exhausted legal recognition of the damage done, a decision meant to prevent further harm. The DA explained that the federal interest had pressured the file into a box that couldn't be reopened without Congress and subpoenas, and the combination of local and federal action made the case airtight enough for the plea to stick. In the middle of legal papers was Bruno's hearing, which felt like an odd echo of the yard, an animal and a human argument over what safety looks like. Derek Walsh from Animal Control sat on the hearing board with a folder of photos and notes, and our trainer sent records showing Bruno's obedience certification and the pattern of commands he'd learned. We presented the videos, the training logs, and testimony that argued Bruno had followed a protection command only when Rachel reached for a weapon. The board listened, asked hard questions, and then handed down a ruling that let Bruno stay with us but under strict conditions. He must wear a muzzle in public, undergo additional training with a certified handler, submit quarterly behavior reports, and we had to carry a $1.2 million liability insurance policy. It felt simultaneously like a victory and a tether, a legal leash attached to the dog who had saved the kids but whose actions also invited examination. After the noise of court and evidence and the filing of orders, we started piecing a life back together in small, stubborn ways. The kids' therapy became a steady scaffolding, twice-weekly sessions with Dr. Claire Bennett who used play and routines to rebuild trust and safety. Naomi's work and the forensic interviews informed therapy approaches so the kids didn't have to retell everything to too many people. Laura and I kept our promise to begin small. Every evening we did 5-minute check-ins where we sat on the couch, hands on each other's knees, and named one thing we'd noticed about the kids that day. It was boring and miraculous. We set hard boundaries for family, no unsupervised visits, no overnight stays with extended family without our supervision, and my parents had to complete a grandparent boundaries course before any supervised visits were allowed. They did it, and when they came back they were quieter and more careful, which felt both necessary and deeply sad. Practical safety measures became rituals I could manage. Monthly device sweeps where we put every tablet and phone on the kitchen counter for a quick check. Security scans scheduled with the company that installed cameras, and a caretaker's rule list for anyone who wanted our trust back. We turned the storage of the past into a checklist. What stayed private now stayed locked and documented. The legal orders stayed in a binder on my office shelf. The no-contact papers meant Rachel's name was a thing we saw on a file and not a person we worried she might cross paths with. The quiet moments are what I remember most now, the small domestic things that felt like proof we had kept something alive. Grace chose new purple curtains and hung them with me on a Saturday afternoon, and she smiled the way a kid smiles when she owns a choice. Owen spent an entire hour lining up dinosaur stickers along his bedroom baseboard, careful and content, and that simple focus made the world stop wanting to collapse for a little while. Bruno sleeps at the foot of our bed with a battered chew toy between his paws. Sometimes I wake to his small sigh and remember the teeth that had saved us and the rules that now keep everyone safe. Some nights Laura and I hold each other in the dark and do not talk. We breathe and let the silence be an agreement. We are protected and we are wary, and that is the only honest place to live. The sentence, the registry, the insurance policies, and the therapy appointments do not erase what happened, but they build a perimeter that keeps our kids moving forward. My shame for not listening still comes in waves, but it is steadied now by action and the slow work of rebuilding trust. This normal is fragile and patchwork, full of scars and careful stitches, and I hold it like a small, urgent thing, imperfect, guarded, and utterly ours.